wind rattled the old wooden shutters, and the house groaned under the weight of a restless night. In the corner of the dimly lit room, a tiny German shepherd puppy trembled under a threadbare blanket, his small body shaking with every shiver of fear. He whimpered softly, a sound so fragile it seemed to hang in the cold air like smoke. Each creak of the floorboards, each sigh of the house, sent him curling tighter into himself, ears flattened, eyes wide and glistening with unshed tears. The world outside the blanket was a storm of shadows and sounds he couldn't understand, and inside there was only the suffocating weight of loneliness. His soft whines were a plea, unheard by anyone, swallowed by the emptiness of the room. Somewhere far away, lights flickered and laughter drifted faintly through the walls, but for him, the night stretched endlessly, a dark, echoing cage. And then, in the hush between sobs and shivers, the faintest sound of footsteps approached. The puppy froze, heart-hammering, unsure if the presence meant safety or more fear. The old house stood crooked against the gray winter sky, its paint peeling in long curling strips, its windows dark and hollow like unblinking eyes. Inside, the wind found every crack and crevice, whistling a cold, mournful song that reverberated through the empty rooms. In the smallest corner of the living room, a tiny German shepherd puppy shivered beneath a threadbare blanket. His body was so small, so fragile, that each quiver seemed like it might shatter him into pieces. And yet he made no sound strong enough to carry across the house. Only a soft, trembling whine escaped when the boards creaked above, or when the wind slammed a shutter against the wall. Every sound, footsteps on the distant porch, the muffled laughter of people passing outside, the sigh of the heater sputtering weakly, made his body curl tighter, his ears flatten, and his eyes widen in silent terror. The puppy's blanket was his fortress and his prison. It smelled faintly of dust, old food crumbs, and the lingering presence of neglect. Yet it was the only thing that offered a shadow of warmth, a suggestion of safety. He pressed his small nose against the rough fabric, inhaling deeply, trying to convince himself that the world could be tamed by cloth alone. His tiny paws twitched as he dreamed of running, of leaping into a sunlit field. But the memory of sharp hands and harsh voices lurked in the back of his mind, rooting him to the cold wooden floor. Every day, every hour, the shadow of fear grew heavier, wrapping around him like a second skin. He remembered in flashes a world before this darkness, a smell of grass under his paws, laughter that was gentle rather than sharp hands that stroked instead of striking. But those memories were like fragments of another life, fading, slipping through his mind like water through a sieve. Now there was only this room, this blanket, the quiet terror, and the endless nights that stretched like miles of gray fog. Rain began to patter against the roof, small, precise taps at first, then gathering into a relentless drumming that shook the windows. The puppy's whines became sharper, more desperate. The wind moaned through the cracked frame, making the walls shiver. He twitched at every sound, imagining the worst at every shadow. The puddles forming outside reflected distorted images of the house, dark water that seemed to trap the reflections of ghosts. And in the center of that darkness, he trembled alone, wishing for someone, anyone, to see him, to hear him, to rescue him from the invisible walls of fear he had built around himself. Sometimes he tried to explore the edges of his small corner, nose quivering in the air, ears flicking at any sound that might signal danger, or perhaps hope. But fear was swift and merciless. One sudden clap of thunder, or the creak of a door, and he would dive back under the blanket, shaking until his tiny body ached. His whines became softer then, almost inaudible, as though hiding the sound would hide him from the threats of the world. His eyes, wide and glistening with unshed tears, scanned the shadows, mapping every inch for possible escape routes. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide that could erase the terror that clawed at his mind. The house, too, seemed alive with indifference. Dust motes floated lazily in the dim light, filtering through cracked curtains, catching on the rough wooden floor. A mouse scuttled somewhere on the walls, prompting another burst of panic from the puppy. Ears pinned, tail tucked so tightly it seemed to vanish. The faint smell of damp wood and mildew pressed against his nostrils, mingling with the sharp tang of his own fear. Every inhale was a reminder of how small, how fragile, and how utterly alone he was. Hours passed like this, measured only by the rhythm of his trembling. He would press his tiny face into the blanket, eyes darting at each flicker of shadow, each sigh of the house, praying for silence, praying for warmth. In the quietest moments, when the storm outside softened into a drizzle and the house creaked less insistently, He would imagine someone walking in, calling his name, and scooping him up into a safe embrace. But the image faded as quickly as it came, leaving him curled tighter, more desperate than before. Then came the first soft sound that didn't make him recoil. Footsteps, careful and slow, hesitated on the floor outside his corner. He froze, every nerve on edge, ears flattened against his skull. Could it be someone who meant to help, or someone who would only cause more fear? His small body trembled in anticipation, unsure if he should run or stay. The steps drew closer, and a voice, soft, gentle, unhurried, spoke. "I'm here." The words were like sunlight piercing a storm cloud, unexpected, fragile, but warm. The puppy's whine slowed, heart hammering, as he pressed himself deeper into the blanket, uncertain if trust was possible. The voice lingered, patient, calling his name in a whisper that trembled with kindness rather than command. Slowly, hesitantly, he peeked out from under the blanket, eyes wide, glistening with both terror and a faint spark of hope. The figure in the doorway was small, a girl, soaked from the rain, crouching low to meet his gaze. She didn't reach for him immediately, didn't force the contact he wasn't ready for. She simply sat there, her voice steady, warm, and inviting, letting him decide if the world could be gentle again. For the first time in what felt like forever, the tiny puppy allowed himself to breathe in the possibility that fear didn't have to rule everything. The blanket, still wrapped around him like a second skin, no longer felt like a prison. It was a bridge, fragile, trembling, but real, between the darkness of his past and the faint glimmer of a new tomorrow. And as the rain whispered against the roof, as the house settled into quiet creaks and groans, he lifted his trembling head just a little higher, eyes fixed on the girl who had, without even touching him, spoken the language he had long forgotten, that someone was listening, that he was not alone. Rain-slicked streets glistened under the dim gray sky as the girl's boots splashed through shallow puddles, each step echoing faintly against the brick walls of the quiet neighborhood. She had been wandering aimlessly, letting the storm guide her, when movement in the shadows caught her eye. A tiny shape shivered beneath a crumpled blanket on the edge of a dilapidated porch, ears pinned back, eyes wide and fearful. The German Shepherd puppy looked like a living fragment of loneliness, each quiver of his body a silent scream, each whine a song of abandonment. Her chest tightened. It was impossible to ignore. His small form was so fragile, so beaten by the weight of fear, that the girl felt a pang in her own chest, a mirror of the helplessness she had often felt in her own life. The rain fell harder now, drumming against the porch roof, plastering her hair to her face, but she didn't step back. Instead, she crouched low, careful not to startle him, letting the water streak her cheeks in tandem with her own rising worry. "It's okay. I won't hurt you," she whispered, her voice trembling like the puppy's body, unsure if it would be enough. She extended a hand slowly, fingers curled like a fragile offering. The puppy froze, every muscle taut, tail tucked so tightly it nearly disappeared beneath his tiny frame. His gaze darted between the hand and the door behind her, indecision and terror warring in his dark, glistening eyes. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. The rain streaked down the sides of the porch, creating small rivers that pooled around his paws. He whimpered softly, a sound almost too quiet to hear over the storm, but it carried the weight of 1,000 nights spent alone, nights spent pressed into a threadbare blanket, trembling against shadows that no one could chase away. His body was taut, every nerve screaming to flee. Yet the girl's calm presence acted like a tether, drawing him just slightly closer. She didn't reach farther. She didn't make a sudden move. She simply sat on the wet wooden floor, letting the rain soak her coat, letting her steady breathing fill the space between them with a quiet promise. The puppy inched forward, nose twitching as he sniffed the air between them, unsure if the smell carried danger or something else, a scent foreign yet oddly comforting. He pressed one paw onto the edge of the blanket, then another, each movement slow, deliberate, a negotiation between instinctive fear and a desperate curiosity. The girl murmured softly, words falling like gentle rain on his trembling ears. "It's okay. You can trust me. I just want to be your friend." Voice whispered, "Don't." And somewhere in that repetition, in the softness of her voice, in the patience of her presence, a crack formed in the hardened shell of his terror. Hours passed like moments. She talked to him, her words a lullaby in the chaos of the storm. She told him stories of sunlit fields, of games and laughter, of warmth that didn't bite and voices that didn't yell. The puppy listened as much as a trembling creature could, letting the vibration of her voice seep into his bones, reminding him that not all humans were harsh or hurried. His trembling slowed slightly, his whimpers becoming softer, almost hesitant, as if he were testing the boundaries of possibility. Could someone truly care? Could someone truly hear the silent pleas buried beneath layers of fear? By the time the storm softened into a drizzle, the puppy was trembling less. His little body still quivered occasionally, ears flicking at every distant sound, but he had inched forward far enough to press his wet nose to the girl's outstretched fingers. Her palm was warm, roughened slightly from chores and small tasks, but steady and gentle. He sniffed, trembling but curious, and allowed the girl to brush her hand over the damp fur along his back. The gesture was infinitesimal in the grand scale of life, yet monumental for a creature who had only ever known isolation and fear. Trust had begun to sprout, delicate and fragile, like a first green shoot after a long, cold winter. The girl smiled, brushing strands of wet hair from her face as she watched him. "You're safe," she whispered again, softly enough to be a secret between the two of them. The puppy's ears twitched, eyes reflecting the dim light of the storm-lit porch, and in that moment, a quiet understanding passed between them. He could feel the difference between hands that might harm and hands that might protect. He could feel that she was patient, that she was waiting for him to choose the first step toward safety, not demanding it. For the first time in countless nights, the puppy's whines were no longer cries of pure fear. They were questions. Questions about trust, about possibility, about whether the world could hold more than shadows and cold wooden floors. The girl shifted slightly, moving closer but still respecting the fragile barrier he had woven around himself. "I'll wait as long as it takes us," she whispered. And the puppy, exhausted from the tremors of the day and the weight of anticipation, lowered his little head toward her palm, allowing a single soft sniff. It was the smallest of gestures, but monumental, a wordless acceptance that maybe, just maybe, he could be seen without fear consuming him. The sky outside began to lighten as the first gray hues of dawn seeped through the clouds. Rain-streaked light fell across the porch, painting the scene in muted silver and wet brown, highlighting the delicate shape of the trembling puppy and the girl's damp, crouched form. Time seemed suspended between the beat of a heart and the rustle of wet leaves. There was no rush, no hurry, only the quiet, steady pulse of mutual recognition. A fragile first seed of trust planted in soil long thought barren. That night, when the girl finally rose to leave, she left a small scarf behind, folded neatly near the blanket. The puppy's dark eyes followed her, hesitant, unsure if the warmth in the object could compete with the chill of the storm outside. But when the door shut and left only the soft hum of settling rain, he nudged it with his nose, pressing his trembling body against it. For the first time, the blanket was not only a shield, it was a bridge, connecting him to a world where someone had noticed, someone had waited, someone had chosen to see him despite all his fear. The puppy curled into the damp scarf, whimpers softening into a quiet, tentative sigh. In the shadows of the broken porch, with rain dripping from the roof and the first light of morning painting the world in pale gold, he let himself imagine that maybe, someday, nights would no longer be measured in terror, but in hope. Days passed, each one dripping slowly like honey, stretching and lingering in a rhythm of cautious discovery. The girl returned, her boots squelching on wet pavement, hair damp from mist and drizzle, carrying a small bag filled with scraps of warmth, a towel, a small chew toy, a plate of food. The puppy huddled beneath his blanket in the corner of the porch, pressed himself lower at first, ears pinned, muscles taut, eyes wide and glimmering with a mixture of hope and skepticism. The memory of fear was stubborn, an old echo in his bones, but the girl's presence carried a quiet insistence that something different was possible. She knelt slowly this time, settling into the damp wood with the patience of a gentle tide, letting him watch, letting him decide when the next move could be made. At first, it was a tentative sniff of her hand, a tremor of recognition mingled with instinctive suspicion. He backed away, pressed deeper into the blanket, yet returned again, nose twitching, body trembling. Each small interaction became a ceremony of trust. She spoke softly, describing the world outside the porch, the warmth of sun on grass, the gentle hiss of rain on rooftops, the laugh of children playing far away. Each word was a seed, and though the soil of his fear was thick and resistant, the girl's patience allowed the first shoots of confidence to break through. He began to lift his head more frequently, ears twitching at sounds rather than flattening in terror. He began to nudge the toy toward her hand, testing whether play could exist without danger, whether touch could exist without pain. By the second week, the puppy's blanket was no longer a fortress of fear, but a resting place between forays into exploration. He ventured a paw outside it, trembling at the unfamiliar texture of wet wood and scattered leaves, only to retreat when the wind shifted sharply or the gutter above gurgled with rainwater. The girl's steady presence was a tether he clung to, her voice a soft anchor in a world that had once been unrelenting terror. She moved slowly, kneeling beside him, reading aloud from a book she had brought, letting the cadence of her voice seep into his nervous system. The vibrations of her words mingled with the rhythm of his racing heart, and slowly, painfully, the tremors softened into something resembling curiosity. Every night was still a test. Shadows loomed larger than they should have. The wind still carved fingers into corners of the porch, and the distant hum of the storm reminded him of all the nights spent shivering alone. Yet now, when fear surged, he had a hand to reach for, a voice to guide him, a warmth to press into. He learned to press his small head against her palm, let his body relax fractionally, and trust that the tremor in his chest would not end in harm. He discovered that human hands could be steady, even gentle, even safe. The girl encouraged him to explore further with every visit. At first it was simply stepping onto the slick boards of the porch, letting the rain wash over his paws, sniffing the wet air. Then it became sniffing the grass at the edge of the yard, wagging a hesitant tail at the small, muddy puddles. He learned that the world outside the blanket could hold textures that didn't bite, smells that didn't sting, sounds that didn't threaten. Each step was a negotiation with fear, a dialogue in motion, a silent conversation between instinct and the quiet insistence of care. And in that negotiation, the puppy began to discover something unfamiliar. Joy. Not a sharp fleeting spike, but a slow quivering pulse in the chest that told him life could be more than survival. She introduced new rituals to anchor him in a sense of safety. Every morning she would sit with him, letting him stretch his legs, sniff the cool grass, feel the sun's weak warmth through a drifting cloud cover. Every evening she read to him as the storm or dusk drew in, letting the cadence of her voice lull him into sleep without fear. When he ate, she allowed him to explore the food at his own pace, never forcing contact, never demanding obedience, only offering patience. Slowly, the trembling began to ease, replaced by tentative confidence. His tail flicked in curiosity, a small signal of engagement with the world he had long deemed hostile. One particularly bright morning, after a night of soft rain, the puppy ventured farther than ever, bounding across the damp grass with clumsy paws, ears perked and eyes alert. The girl laughed softly, chasing after him, letting him feel the exhilaration of movement unbound by fear. He paused at the edge of a puddle, nose dipping cautiously into the water, and for the first time, he didn't retreat at the first ripple. Instead, he splashed lightly, discovering a texture that could be enjoyed, not feared. Joy, tentative and trembling, began to root itself in the marrow of his bones. The small victories compounded. The blanket was no longer a cage, it was a comfort. The world outside the porch was no longer a threat. It was a landscape of possibility. And in this delicate growth, the girl and the puppy discovered a rhythm of trust, one that required patience, gentleness, and repeated affirmation. Each sniff, each cautious paw forward, each hesitant wag of the tail was a step away from fear and a step toward life. And yet, even as trust deepened, the echoes of terror lingered. Shadows still loomed. Unexpected noises still triggered flinches, and thunder in the distance reminded him of nights when no one had come, when blankets could not protect him from the world's harshness. But now, for the first time, he had someone to navigate it with, a partner in patience, a guardian in gentleness, a voice that promised over and over that he was safe. Each tremble was now a step in a dance with courage. Each whine a question of possibility, each hesitant exploration a declaration that he could survive and, eventually, thrive. By the end of the third week, the puppy had begun to breathe in a new way. Not the shallow, terrified gasps that had defined his nights, but slow, measured inhalations that carried curiosity and tentative hope. He lifted his head, sniffing the air freely, ears twitching at the distant chirp of birds rather than flattening in alarm. He ventured further into the yard, nose nudging grass and puddles, tail wagging faintly, body still small but sturdier with every step. And at the edge of it all, the girl sat patiently, voice a soft tether, hand ready, heart open, teaching him the language of trust that had been absent for too long. For the first time, he began to understand that life could hold more than fear. That warmth could be constant. That a hand, a voice, a presence could anchor him against the storm. That nights could pass without shivers, without despair. That joy, tentative and trembling, could take root even in the smallest, most fragile of hearts. The night arrived heavy and black, the air pregnant with the scent of rain-soaked earth and the distant tang of ozone before a storm. Clouds rolled across the sky in thick, angry waves, and the wind howled, rattling the weak shutters of the old house as if it wanted to shake the world apart. Inside, the puppy lay curled on his blanket, muscles tense, ears flicking at every creak and sigh of the settling walls. He had come far. His paws had touched wet grass. His nose had felt sunlight. But this night felt different. There was an urgency in the air, a rhythm of chaos that throbbed through his chest and demanded attention. Even his small heart could sense the weight of it. A crack of thunder split the sky, reverberating through the house like a gunshot. The puppy jumped, yelping, legs splaying as if the floor itself might rise up to swallow him. He bolted, flinging the blanket aside, paws scrabbling against the slick wood floor. Every instinct screamed for flight, for escape, for invisibility. The storm became a blur of shadows and sounds, the wind tearing through broken boards, the rain hammering the roof, the distant rumbles vibrating through the wall. His body shook violently, not just with fear, but with the memory of nights spent alone, nights when the world had been merciless and nothing had protected him. The girl's voice cut through the roar of the storm, soft but insistent. "It's okay. Come here. I'm right here." The puppy paused for a fraction, ears twitching, heart pounding in a desperate rhythm. The voice was familiar, warm, and yet the terror clawing at him was relentless, demanding he flee. He darted past her, paws slipping on the wet floor, and skidded into the corner of the living room, eyes wide, pupils dilated, every muscle taut with panic. His chest rose and fell so rapidly that he seemed barely able to breathe. The storm outside mirrored the storm inside him, an echoing symphony of chaos that threatened to overwhelm. The girl followed carefully, sliding on puddles and patches of mud that had seeped in from the rain-soaked porch. She crouched low, extending a hand without forcing contact, letting him see her movement as gentle, predictable, a safe point in a world gone mad. "You can do this. You're not alone. I won't let anything happen to you," she whispered, her voice rising and falling with the rhythm of the storm. She had watched him grow over weeks, seen him tremble at shadows, shrink at distant noises, and yet each small triumph had brought him closer to trust. Now, faced with the crucible of raw, elemental fear, every lesson was tested. He whined small, high-pitched, almost like a fragile thread of sound in the cacophony of thunder and rain. His paws scraped the floor as if trying to dig a hole out of the terror, tail tucked tight beneath him, eyes darting from shadow to shadow. The storm outside painted the room with fleeting flashes of light, illuminating the girl's outstretched hand, the soft expression of patience on her face. Her presence was a tether, a lifeline thrown into the churning seas of his anxiety. But would he grab it? Could he trust it when every muscle screamed to run, to hide, to curl into a shivering knot of self-preservation? Lightning flared and the walls seemed to shiver with it. The puppy bolted again, darting across the room, paws slick on the wet floor. The girl's heart thudded painfully as she followed, calling his name with unwavering steadiness. "It's okay. Come to me. Please." She reached out, and for a heartbeat their eyes met. The dark, glistening eyes of terror locked with a warm, insistent gaze of patience. He froze, trembling violently, breath ragged, then slowly, hesitantly began to inch toward her. Each step was a negotiation with every memory of fear, every instinct that had kept him crouched in corners, waiting for the world to strike. The storm raged around them, but in that fragile space, the girl and the puppy were suspended, a microcosm of trust and terror. His small body pressed into her palm, tremors still racing through him, but not from the floorboards or the shadows. This time the trembling was the aftermath of fear confronted, tested, and survived. She held him close, pressing her forehead lightly against his small skull, whispering softly, letting her heartbeat and warmth remind him that the storm outside could not touch the sanctuary they created together. Hours passed, though the storm never truly relented. Oh, the puppy's shivers slowly faded, replaced with small twitches of curiosity as he sniffed at the floor, ears flicking at distant rumbles rather than flattening in terror. He began to learn something vital. Fear could be survived, even conquered with patience, presence, and love. He learned that storms, both literal and figurative, would come, and that the only way forward was to face them with the anchor of trust he had begun to understand. The girl never let go. She wrapped him in a towel, carrying him to the corner of the porch where the rain could not reach. She hummed a soft tune, a song that mingled with the drumming of the storm and the patter of rain, weaving a fragile cocoon of comfort around him. His tiny body nestled against her chest, trembling occasionally, but each shiver was smaller, less insistent, a quiet victory over the panic that had once ruled his nights. She stroked his fur, whispering words of encouragement, letting him feel that fear could be met without destruction, that the world could hold safety as well as threat. By dawn, the storm had passed, leaving the air crisp and clean, scented with wet earth and the faint promise of renewal. The puppy lay curled against the girl, eyes half closed, ears relaxed, chest rising and falling in slow, steady breaths. He had faced a terror greater than any he had known, and he had survived, not alone, but with someone who refused to leave his side. In the pale light, the girl brushed damp strands of hair from her face, smiling softly as she watched him explore the small space around them. Each tentative step he took, each sniff, each cautious movement was a testament to resilience, to the power of patience, to the fragile but unbreakable bond forming between them. For the first time, he understood something profound. Fear might always exist, but trust could exist alongside it. Courage was not the absence of trembling, but the willingness to take a step despite it. And as the morning light stretched across the porch, illuminating his small, wet form, he lifted his head, ears alert, eyes soft but curious. The storm had tested him, pushed him to the edge, and in surviving it, he had begun to claim a world that once felt impossibly hostile. The storm had passed, leaving the world washed clean in soft gray light that slipped gently through the cracked curtains. The air smelled of wet earth and new beginnings, the faint scent of rain lingering on every surface. The puppy lay curled beside the girl on the porch, blanket pushed aside, small chest rising and falling in a rhythm untainted by fear. His ears twitched at the distant sound of birds returning to the trees. His nose lifted to catch the scent of damp grass, and for the first time in his young life, the tremor in his body was not driven by terror. It was curiosity. It was freedom. It was the quiet, fragile pulse of hope that had been nurtured through weeks of patience, care, and unwavering presence. The girl smiled, her hand resting lightly on his back, feeling the warmth of his fur, the steady beat of his heart, the small yet profound victories etched into every muscle. She had watched him emerge from shadow after shadow, had waited while he cautiously explored the edges of the porch, had endured the storm by his side without ever rushing, without ever forcing him to confront what he was not ready to face. And now in the pale dawn, she saw the culmination of that devotion. A creature that had once known only fear, now beginning to inhabit the world with tentative joy. He ventured further, paws wet against the soft grass at the edge of the yard, nose quivering as he sniffed the earth. He bounded clumsily over puddles, tail flicking in cautious delight, ears pricked forward in alert curiosity rather than pressed back in terror. The girl's laughter rose like sunlight through the morning mist, a soft melodic sound that seemed to settle the final tremors still lingering in his small body. She ran a few steps behind him, arms open, letting him feel the exhilaration of movement unbound by fear. Every jump, every hesitant exploration, every soft bark was a declaration. He had survived, he had learned, he had begun to trust. For the puppy, the blanket was no longer a prison. It was a memory, a cushion between the life he had endured and the life he was beginning to claim. The yard, once a landscape of potential terror, had become a playground, a canvas for his curiosity. He sniffed at the muddy earth, chased the reflections of clouds in puddles, and tilted his head at the chirp of a bird perched in a nearby tree. Each movement, each sound, each discovery was a celebration of a heart that had been given the gift of patience, love, and unwavering presence. The girl knelt on the grass, calling softly, and he ran to her, leaping into her arms with clumsy, exuberant energy. She held him close, pressing her forehead against his, feeling the warmth and life radiating from his small body. "You're safe," she whispered, her voice carrying over the soft rustle of the leaves, over the distant hum of a city waking, over the last echoes of the storm. And in that moment, the puppy seemed to understand. Safety was not just a place, not just a blanket, not just the absence of danger. Nights of trembling, he explored the yard more freely now, tail wagging in growing confidence, bounding across the wet grass with abandon. The girl followed, letting him lead, letting him claim space, letting him discover the world at his own pace. He chased leaves blown by the breeze, sniffed at flowers pushed up by the rain, and barked softly at the small movements of birds and insects. Fear was still present, a faint echo in the edges of his awareness, but it no longer dictated his actions. Curiosity, trust, and joy had taken root in its place. The afternoon sun broke through the lingering clouds, casting long golden rays across the yard, and the puppy ran through them, black fur glistening, eyes bright with newfound courage. He paused to look back at the girl, tail wagging, ears alert, a silent acknowledgement of the bond that had brought him here. She smiled, a soft, knowing smile, and extended her hand. He nudged it gently with his nose, pressing close before darting off again, exploring the world as one finally unbound by the weight of terror. Even the house, once oppressive and cold, seemed transformed in the light of their shared triumph. The creaks of the floorboards now sounded like gentle music rather than threats. Shadows no longer loomed with menace. They were simply part of a world that could be observed, explored, and even enjoyed. The puppy returned repeatedly to the porch, to the girl's side, resting in the warmth of her presence before bounding out again. Each return was a quiet testament to trust, a declaration that he was no longer alone, that love and patience could overcome fear, that life could be lived fully even after trauma. As evening approached, the sun dipping low and painting the yard in soft amber hues, the puppy settled beside the girl one last time for the day. The blanket, now loosely draped around him, was no longer a barrier but a comfort, a small island of familiarity in a world he had begun to explore confidently. He rested his head on her lap, eyes half closed, ears relaxed, breath slow and steady. She stroked his fur, feeling the rise and fall of his chest, sensing the quiet depth of his trust and the hard-won joy that now filled the space he had once only occupied with fear. For the first time, both girl and puppy existed in perfect harmony, two hearts tethered by patience, kindness, and mutual recognition. The world outside could no longer intimidate him. He had learned the language of trust, the rhythm of love, the courage that comes from knowing someone will never let go. And as the final rays of sunlight faded into a soft twilight, the puppy lifted his head, sniffing the warm, rain-soaked air, tail wagging gently, eyes bright with life. The girl smiled, heart full, whispering softly, "You're free now. Truly free." And in that moment, the puppy's world, once measured in trembling whines and shadowed corners, expanded into endless possibilities. He had survived fear. He had discovered trust. He had learned joy. And with a final glance at the girl who had never left him, he bounded forward into the golden light of a new beginning, a heart set free at last.